I am the co founder of the Humanism Project in Australia and the executive director of the International Council of Indian Muslims. Thank you for participating in our event today. I'm joining you from Sydney, Australia. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I live and thrive on Darug land. I pay my respects to its elders, past, present, and emerging. I recognize that sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Darug land. Islamophobia is a global scourge which has reached a feverish pitch in India in recent times. In this roundtable, global and Indian experts come together to discuss India's role in global Islamophobia, the impact of Islamophobia on Indian Muslims, strategies to counter Islamophobia, and explore some ways forward. We commence this session with talks from my esteemed panelists, followed by a short discussion, and end with a statement of solidarity from a New South Wales Greens MP, David Shoebridge. That'll be followed by a close of the plenary statement by Professor Stanton. Allow me to kick off our session by introducing Professor Hatem Bazian. Professor Bazian is a co-founder and professor of Islamic law and theology at Zaytuna College, the first accredited Muslim liberal arts college in the United States. In addition, Professor Bazian is a lecturer in the departments of Near Eastern, Asian American, and Asian Diaspora Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. In 2009, Professor Bazian founded at Berkeley the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project at the Center for Race and Gender, a research unit dedicated to the systematic study of othering Islam and Muslims. In spring of 2012, Prof. Bazian launched the Islamophobia Studies Journal, which is published biannually. In addition to his academic engagements, he's a weekly columnist for the Turkish daily Sabah newspaper and Turkey Agenda online magazine. We invite you to welcome Professor. Sorry, over to Professor.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Arun, for the introduction. Speaking to you from another settler colonial occupied territory. I'm in the unceded land of the Ohlone people here in Berkeley, California. But more importantly, as I just heard the news earlier today, that I'm the mastermind of whatever is taking place. And again, I give them credit. One, they attribute that there is a mind, which I can't say much for the Islamophobia industry. And master, I will set that aside. But in the work of Islamophobia in general, I think what we identified is 5 distinctive zones where Islamophobia is articulated. One is North America and parts of the English-speaking European areas, and by extension, I would say maybe Australia, New Zealand can be included. That's a distinctive zone where the engagement with the Muslims tend to focus on securitization, the notion of countering violent extremism with informants, monitoring Muslim institutions, and so on. So that's a very distinctive zone. The second zone is the French-speaking zone, and that includes France, Quebec in Canada, and also some of the Francophone countries, not as much, where in there is really the direct governing the body, the space and time of Muslims, in the sense that the French have their distinctive approach that they want to regulate the dress code of the Muslims, in particular relative to women. They set up a board to govern Muslim institutions, which is an ironic contradiction. And if you think a secular state setting up a governing structure to govern a religious institution. So now in France, we have the Mufti of France is Macron, because whatever he decides actually is to be fulfilled. And this is under the whole laissez-faire type of framing. So that's a distinctive zone. The third is the zone in the Muslim majority states, where the term of what is good Islam, bad Islam, what is the state crafting of Islam opposite its opposition, or those who want a greater level of freedom, participation. So if you want democratic institutions, if you want election, then you're the bad Muslim. And as such, your type of Islam gets to be entangled with state policy. So that's Muslim majority state. And we actually have a whole book that looks at Islamophobia in Muslim majority states. The fourth zone is the social media space, which is very, very distinctive. And I think when we speak about India, it does have an impact. And in here, one is immediately transnational. So really, there is no such thing as local, because as soon if it's in Facebook, if it's in Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and whatever new form, it's immediately transnational. Second, there's monetization of social media for political campaigns, i.e., you think about the Brexit with the Cambridge Analytica, if you think about the PGP party and the Hindutva, if you think about Trump and the use of targeted ads using the data from Facebook, so that's in there. And I would say intelligence operations, thinking of the Ukraine and Russia right now, as well as some of the Arab and Muslim states using social media to drive particular policies and shifts within the state. The last zone is what we call genocide zone. These are areas where Muslims are actually facing genocidal policies with Islamophobic framing. This involves China with the Uyghur, Myanmar in relations to the Rohingya population. You could include Palestine in relations to the dynamics inside the Palestinian territories. And then we come to India, where both in Kashmir and also India proper, you have a whole structure of genocide that is being pushed. It's not only governing the space and body, trying to remove the hijab, even though that we're seeing this policy being implemented. It's a whole rejection of the presence of Muslims in the society as Muslims, with the full articulations of rights, citizenship, and protection that is accorded in relation to India as it relates to the constitution. So if we think of Kashmir, where the notion of 900,000 plus troops being deployed in there, which is connected to this notion that the Kashmir is the birthplace of the purity of the Hindutva or the Hindu nation, and then it leads into various parts of India. In our work on the Islamophobia in India, stalking bigotry, we looked at a number of elements. And as you know, researching India is a very challenging undertaking. There is no centralized depository for data. There isn't a classification of racial fomented violence and racialization. Also, in relations to religion as an identity relative to reporting. And then the fact that you have such a huge country with a massive population, diversity of languages, ethnicities, challenges, makes data very, very difficult to come by. But setting that aside, we could identify a number of elements. One is the notion that Muslims are colonizers, that Muslims are part of a colonial legacy. And in here, it's again, a person has to, what you call, scratch their head, that India was colonized by the British. India was actually looted of close to $45 trillion worth of wealth was taken from India from the British. But in here, as a way to craft an idealistic historical past, bypassing the British colonial discourse, that the Muslims are able to be the colonial intrusion on India, which immediately erases the ethnic specificity of the Indian Muslims being Indian and Muslim. Rather now they're projected being Arab invasion and trying to cast them as an other and externalizing. So there's an important way in here to both understand the history of colonization and also to challenge the notion of when do we use the notion of colonization? Again, among certain segments, both of the Hindutva, the PGP activists, and also you could see it in some of the Islamophobic institutions. And thus, the notion of flattening the surface when we talk about colonization. And in this notion, you would think that Adam and Eve, when they came from the heavens to the earth, they were colonizers. Because if you flatten the surface and there is no nuances, then from the dinosaur perspective, and some of those in the Islamophobia industry, I would say they're dinosaur in terms of their mind in this sense. So you actually flatten the surface, so there is no point of analysis of what occurred distinctively in the colonial era. So this notion of who's the colonizer and the Muslims being framed as colonizers. And the second, which adds to this, is the removal of citizenship. And I don't think we saw that, especially in Assam, removing 5 million from the voting rosters. And this has in every nationalist, ultra-nationalist, racist type of political structure, the right to vote, and who is to be given that right to vote is very critical, because if you are unable to present your program in a fair, equal access election, then you actually engage in trying to engineer the roster of voters in order to completely disempower the population. So if we looked at the South Africa during the apartheid regime, the majority of the population, which was Black, was completely disenfranchised. In America, we had what you call an apartheid structure, all the way from the adoption of the Constitution, all the way up to the 1964 Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act that included people's right to vote. So this is very critical that the PGP, in essence, is learning the wrong lesson from history, both from South Africa, as well as in terms of America, in terms of removing the citizenship, right to vote, and act. Then we looked at what you call geography of Islamophobia, in the sense that Muslims are being made to be unsafe in various districts. And I think increasingly we're seeing this assaults and attacks that takes place in areas where Muslims live, attacks on their mosque, attacks on their population, attacks on students going to school, attacks on women. And this whole notion is the geography of inclusion and the geography of exclusion. Again, this is somewhat also normative with a long history of racialized minorities, where in essence trying to create them, put them in ghettos, and even the ghettos becomes the site of targeting in essence, and put them as almost the unwanted segment. And the choice becomes either you put up with the violence, structural violence from a state perspective, or you end up leaving. And again, this notion of trying to get the Muslims to leave and saying go to Pakistan and Bangladesh is some of these notions about the geography of Islamophobia that we are witnessing in relation to India. The next element, and I think you are already possibly some of the individuals will speak about, is this love jihad notion. And I would argue that the love jihad, the relationship between the Dalits, or the notions of the untouchables, and the Muslim historically has been positive, even though that there is tension in there as such. And the notion of attempting to drive a wedge between the Muslims and the Dalits and maybe some segments of the Hindu is a very shrewd strategy of trying to actually make the only option for the Hindus in the society is to actually come home, or the whole notion of coming home within India. And I think the largest segment within the Indian society is a large segment of the untouchables, that its historical alignment of the Muslims prevents the success from this Hindu nationalist Hindutva type of a strategy. And I think this is a deliberate approach that is somewhat similar, with some distinctive differences with the replacement theory that you see it active in European discourse, that all these immigrants, refugees, and in particular Muslims are being viewed as a replacement, and their engagement with the white segments of the society is really for nefarious purposes. And in this sense, you actually lose the full sense of why we are having large immigrants and refugees in the move. So in essence, erasing the interventions, erasing the war, erasing the continued disruption of much of the global South. So this love jihad is really have a very strategic deployment, which in essence to make the Hindu majority, Dalit in particular, to stay away from and not to build the resistance bridges with the Muslims. Now, for the Muslim population, I do actually also would counsel them that they need to actually be very deliberate and strategic in building their relationship with the Dalit, because I do this thing that some Muslims who possibly embrace the historical distance that the Hindu Brahmins have had with the Dalit, that they replicate it in relation to Islamic behavior. So I think there has to be some notion within the Muslim population in India to do likewise. The last is in terms of the instrumentalization of violence. We see this in relation to the violence with the assaults and the lynchings as a result of the beef eating accusations. And in here you have the intersectionality of social media, which has been a major instrument within the Hindutva, which also puts the responsibility on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, all these, which tends to be hyperactive in governing Muslim expressions on social media, but they actually often are late to the table when it comes to the use of their social media platform to target Muslims, especially as many of the occurrences of the beef lynching cases that it starts in the social media, on Twitter in particular and Facebook, and the street mob actually targets the Muslim subject, ending in lynching, and then after the fact that the media actually removes the video of the lynching rather than actually removing the call for the lynching. And this is very ironic, as we know that India is one of the largest exporter of beef to the Muslim world. So I guess you stay on principle on, on the sacred nature of the cow, which again, we respect people's religious perspective, but when it comes to financial interest, that goes by the sideway. And in here, I think we need to challenge these contradictions and make sure that Muslims are not used as an instrument to driving this structured violence. Beginning in Gujarat, and again, we're just in the anniversary of the Gujarat attacks that have taken place, with Modi was a central figure in this. And now I think Muslims across India are facing the same type of dynamics at this particular time. So I'm hoping that this panel and this conference in the past 3 days will bring people into action to try to stop an impending genocide. And I know that the Genocide Watch have already articulated a warning for what is to be expected. And the writing on the wall, we could see it, and we could see and really have comparative cases to identify what is taking place. So I urge people to take actions to stop this down spiral toward a genocidal dynamic that are being led by a political party that actually still is inspired by some of the darkest ideological underpinnings that comes out to us from European history. So I think the call is urgent and serious. So thank you for listening, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Professor Bazzi. That was really insightful. If I may just pick on something that you have said and segue on to the next session, I think one thing you highlighted was social media and how that's used to significantly amplify the Hindutva hate narrative. What it has done, even to diasporic communities, it's caused fractures within diasporic communities. We had violence in the streets of Sydney. We had violence in Canada. And clearly in the United States, it's been causing a lot of turmoil before what was a very cohesive Indian community. To speak on that, we have our next speaker, Mr. Ajit Sahi, who is a veteran journalist who's been looking at this for a long time and a human rights activist from India. He's currently based in Washington, D.C., where he serves as the advocacy director of the Indian American Muslim Council, a registered nonprofit that has been at the forefront of disseminating the truth about the RSS, BJP, and the Modi government, combating Hindutva as well as the Islamophobic ideology of Hindu nationalism that has an immense footprint in the United States. Mr. Sahi will talk about Hindu nationalism and Islamophobia in the United States. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Brother Harun Qasim from Australia. It must be very late in the night for you. So thank you for taking time out and not sleeping tonight to join us on this subject. I'm grateful to the organizers of this conference, and I would like to recognize the three co-chairs, Dr. Gregory Stanton of Genocide Watch, Professor Ritambara Manavi of Sticking the London Story, and Mr. Rashid Ahmed of Indian American Muslim Council, who are also present on this panel with us. Thank you, Professor Bazian, for your absolutely amazing comments. And I look forward, after I've finished my speaking, I look forward to comments from Brother Shaheen and Sister Rita Jabri Makwel. I would like to keep my comments briefly on what is going on in the United States of America. Let me start with a protest, or rather with a rally that was organized by a few Hindu organizations, so-called Hindu organizations, but they clearly identify with the Hindu nationalists back in India. This rally, it was a car rally that was taken out in the city of Houston on Saturday, that is 2 days ago, on February 26th. And Houston is also the city where in September of 2019, a massive program was organized at an indoor stadium, which was called Howdy Modi, where India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi was visiting. And the then President of the United States, Donald Trump, had gone there. And a number of members of Congress had lined up to shake hands with Mr. Modi. The stadium was filled with almost 50,000 people at that time. And that event was organized by the who's who of the Hindu American community, those people who identify very closely with the Hindu nationalist movement back in India. This Saturday's car rally, and this is why I chose to start my comments by talking about this rally. It started from a temple, a Hindu temple. That was the place which is supposed to be a Hindu temple, is supposed to be agnostic of nationalist supremacist ideologies. A Hindu temple, like a church, like a synagogue, like a mosque, it's not supposed to be a location for political ideologies to express themselves and expand their footprint. But this car rally started from a Hindu temple, a temple of Lord Shiva, ironically, Lord Shiva, who is a destroyer. And Lord Shiva's temple has been used by Hindu right-wing people. Now, if you go back in time, say about 7-8 months, last year in June, there was a news item in the US newspapers, especially the New York Times, that there is a temple, a Hindu temple in the state of New Jersey, where the Federal Bureau of Investigation had raided and rescued a number of people who had been brought in from India to work as laborers and masons on the construction of that temple. And the management of that Hindu temple had allegedly taken away their passports, and it was paying them abysmal wages of as little as $1 a day. That's the kind of wages they were being paid. They were not allowed to go out. They were not allowed to be fed. And most of them belonged to the Dalit community, which is the lowest community in the lowest rung of the Hindu community. Now, all of these Hindu temples are intimately connected with the network of Hindu right-wing organizations in the United States of America. These organizations include Vishwa Hindu Parishad of America, VHPA, which announces itself to be distinct from the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, which basically Vishwa means world, Hindu means Hindu, and Parishad means council. So there is a Vishwa Hindu Parishad or World Hindu Council in India, and there is a World Hindu Council in the United States. Obviously, the United States version claims to be an independent autonomous organization, but if you go to their website, they're completely joined at the hip ideologically and in a large part of their actions with their namesake back in India. Likewise, the Hindu Swayam Sevak Sangh, which has existed in the United States for more than 30 years. The HSS is virtually a fellow traveler with the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, which is the 97-year-old Hindu supremacist movement from India. There are a large number of other organizations also. Many people know that that Indian embassies across the world are literally, virtually now doubling up as front offices for the Hindu supremacists. The Hindu supremacists are going around their campaign and advocacy in the United States by pretending that they are bringing yoga. Yoga in itself has been appropriated by these Hindu supremacist ideological people. They pretend that they are talking about yoga, but basically what they are doing is that they are expanding the footprint of Hindu nationalism, Hindu nationalistic ideologies. Just a couple of months ago, the California State University system, it adopted caste as a part of its set of policies that officially look out for discrimination against vulnerable and marginalized communities. And the Hindu American Foundation, which is a very large, prominent Hindu organization in the United States, which is in the business, apart from other thing else, of filing defamation lawsuits against people who question it and who call it out. And so therefore, it basically wants to shut down any kind of criticism. The Hindu American Foundation, they started a campaign, and it was not a secret campaign. They were quite open about it. They started a campaign asking the California State University system to not include the marginalized communities of the Dalits, who are the former untouchable communities. Even today in India, they are considered untouchable by a wide section of the Hindu community. But the Hindu American Foundation, instead of supporting the California State University system for including the Dalits in that list, they actually wanted that the Dalits to be excluded from that list. Because all of these organizations, whether it is the Hindu Swayam Sevak Sangh, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, or the World Hindu Council of America, the Hindu American Foundation, there are others like Ekal Vidyalay, there are others like Seva International, which reportedly raised about $18 million during COVID times. All of these organizations are dominated by upper caste Hindus, mostly Brahmins. This is the fundamental structure of Hindu nationalism. It is dominated by Brahmins, people who have been at the top of the food chain of the Hindu society for supposedly more than 2,000 years. It is the Brahmins and the Thakurs and the Baniyas who rule this system, this universe. That is why, if you look at the RSS back in India, it is completely dominated by the upper caste people. In 97 years, except for one, all the chiefs of the RSS have been Brahmins. The top leadership, the top 20, 30 people of the RSS, you will hardly find a non-Brahmin among them. And you will never find anybody from the lower castes, least of all from the Dalit community. Basically, the Hindu supremacist movement that has trained its guns on Muslims and Christians in India is nothing more than an assertion of Brahminical supremacy. That is how they run the Hindu society, and that is how they want to run the rest of Indian society. And that is how their approach in the United States is. If you look at the people employed by the Hindu American Foundation and all of the other organizations, their leadership, they're all upper castes. Moving on to how they are approaching the political system. When Pramila Jayapal, a member of Congress who came out against the Modi government 2 years ago, these organizations, they went after her. When Ro Khanna, who is also an Indian American, just like Pramila Jayapal, he tweeted against Hindutva in August or September of 2019, these organizations went ballistic against him. Last year, in the city of Chicago, the City Council of Chicago, it considered a resolution to defeat a resolution against the discriminatory citizenship laws in India, which are targeting Muslims and which aim to render India's 200 million Muslims as non-citizens. And when this resolution was brought before the Chicago City Council, one of our co-organizers here, Hindus for Human Rights, one of its founding members, Raju Rajagopal, has written a piece in AmericanKahani.com just 2 days ago, where he says that Democratic representative in Congress, Raja Krishnamurthy, he worked very closely with the Indian consulate in Chicago to get this resolution defeated at the city council. So at every level you see, whether you see a Democrat such as in the Vermont state, Kesharam Hinsdale, she is openly releasing videos saying, "I'm proud of my connection with Hindu American Foundation." If you start probing deeper into their causes, they are very closely connected with organizations such as Middle East Forum, which is an extreme right-wing Islamophobic Zionist organization in the United States of America, founded by somebody who is considered, Middle East Forum has been called as an Islamophobic organization by Southern Poverty Law Center. Its founder has been called that. It has been connected with the most right-wing elements in Europe. If you remember the white racist terrorist who killed more than 70 people, I think in 2012 in Norway, he had written a 500-page memorandum, and he had said that he had spoken in laudatory terms about Middle East Forum and its founder, and about Hindu nationalism. Hindu nationalism in America is expanding in a major way. I'm prone to believe that the Hindu nationalists are bigger Islamophobes than even white racists in the United States of America. This is something that the United States government, the United States political parties, the US politicians and lawmakers can ill afford to ignore, because in times to come, these very people, ironically, despite being an immigrant community themselves, I'm not saying all Hindu Americans, definitely not all Hindu Americans, but the organized Hindu American right-wing organizations, their focus is to expand Islamophobia in the United States, to turn public policy making against Muslims in the United States. They're going after police departments, they're going after mayors, they are going after city councils, they are going after governors, after state legislatures and the national legislature, to threaten them and to silence them from speaking out in favor of Muslims, in support of Muslims, especially those who are being persecuted in India. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sahi Saab. And I might just pick up on something you said and something Professor Bazian said. It was so nice to see you make those correlations between Brahmanism and dehumanization of the Dalits and dehumanization of the Muslims, which is really Islamophobia. So on top is this common denominator of the oppressor class that has this tendency to just dehumanize everyone else, and the Dalit narrative and the Islamophobic narrative has so much similarities, and that's clearly on which we are building solidarity and working together. On that topic of dehumanization, I might bring in Sister Rita Jabri Markwell. She has been a great support to our work here in Australia. We lean very heavily on her for advice. Sister Jabri is an Australian lawyer and a policy advocate concerned with both protections and freedoms. Through the Australian Muslim Advocacy Network, she has problem solved in areas of content moderation and regulation, counterterrorism law, online extremism, hate crime, free speech, hate speech, and disinformation. Bringing in practitioner experience, she has published with researchers in a number of disciplines. She's a current member of the Christchurch Call Advisory Network and Legal Frameworks Working Group of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. Her public policy career began in Australian federal politics as a ministerial advisor in the Rudd and Gillard governments. Sister Jabri Markwell will be talking about the dehumanizing constructs and Islamophobia, and her work on the dehumanizing construct and Islamophobia. Over to you, Sister. I think you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, so look, big respect to all the other speakers who I really honor for their expertise. What I hope to bring to the table today is some food for thought on the solution side as we move forward as, Muslim communities worldwide, but beyond our Muslim communities, all communities that are affected by dehumanization. And I think that moving forward, we are facing a lot of transnational threats now in terms of, movements. And we need to find ways to build those alliances. And I think because hate is a very emotional process, it often can't be countered through rational argument. Even, when you get into discussions about Islamophobia, you'll be shut down and told that you're just trying to play the victim card, etc. It's very hard to reason through a lot of Islamophobia. So what I've been proposing through drawing on genocide prevention research, is for our international communities to start looking at definitions of dehumanizing speech and dehumanizing discourse. And the reason why I want to focus on discourse is because I think a lot of the interventions we make around hate speech are acting too late. People who are already speaking with hate are already psychologically, they've already been changed. And that is really much like an illness of the heart. It's very hard to change. And if we can act earlier upstream to intervene in the discourses that are dehumanizing a protected group, we are preventing hatred from happening. So the idea that I can actually share some of the definitions maybe at this point, just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. And I can share my screen. Yeah, thank you so much. So what you can see here is a definition for dehumanizing language, which is drawn from the work of Maynard and Benesch. And that includes material that may present a class of persons on the base of a protected attribute to have the appearance, qualities, or behavior of an animal, insect, filth, form of disease, or bacteria, to be inanimate or mechanical objects, or even a supernatural threat. This is the most, I suppose, the most traditional way of understanding dehumanizing or dehumanization. But where I think we need to go is now in defining dehumanizing discourse. And this is a definition that we put forward as a working definition, building off Maynard and Benesch's work. And that includes the sustained curation of information to a specific audience to suggest that a class of persons on the basis of an identified characteristic, such as their race or religion, are polluting, despoiling, or debilitating society, have a diminished capacity for human warmth and feeling or independent thought, or act in concert to cause mortal or bodily harm, or are to be held responsible for or deserving of collective punishment for the specific crimes or alleged crimes of some of the members. So the idea, what we've done here is try to map the contours of disinformation, which is such a big problem that we face when it comes from political actors that are very powerful, very influential. Yet being able to disrupt disinformation is hard because there will always be an argument about, well, when do you intervene? How do you justify your interventions? And there is a really strong basis in our historical research on genocides to use dehumanization as that measure of when we disrupt. And I think there are a few ways this definition could be used. And one way is through education. And here I'm really excited to be talking more with Professor Mohan Datar about how community pedagogies could be used to, for communities to empower themselves, to learn about how this works so they can resist against it in different ways. But from a legal perspective, which is where I come from, I'm looking at ways that this could be brought into some sort of international standard to guide political actors, policymakers, legislators, and that they have a legal obligation to take remedial action, to make adjustments to whatever they are saying or doing if they are contributing to dehumanizing discourse. And I think that this would be a really important and necessary addition to the current framework that we have, which at the moment only, if we look at the Rome Statute, is only about preventing, so it blocks you from inciting genocide. And we obviously have protections against the advocacy of hatred. But we sort of have this gap where it comes to talking about disinformation and discourse. And this is what I think we need to kind of have that really clear explanation of what is disinformation or discourse that dehumanizes an out-group to an in-group audience over time. And we talked about caste before. That is another class of persons who are being dehumanized, who would be protected by this definition. And just about any protected group under human rights law could be protected under this definition. So I'll probably wrap it up there, but I'm really interested in being able to support more cross-community alliances where we can build awareness about solutions that sort of cut right across many different spheres, whether it's education, law, content moderation, the online sphere, the political sphere, and also across different global contexts. This is absolutely essential to stopping genocide. And we are terrified about what's happening in India. It's always shocking that there can be any community that is on the brink of experiencing mass violence, and there isn't the international response that you're looking for. And I really commend the organizers of this summit, because now is the time. It's actually an opportunity for so many different communities globally to organize and to start building the frameworks that will keep our community, all our communities safer right into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Rita. That's very insightful. Just to quickly answer your question, answer the thing about dehumanization. To pick up on the concept of dehumanization for the benefit of the rest of the panel. So Sister Rita brings the dehumanization legal construct, which, to validate, like Sister Rita said, we are testing that through a culture-centered approach driven by Professor Mohan Datta. That way we get validation across communities, and that helps us validate the thing. And that's some of the work which, like Sister Rita said, would be something that would be great if we could, collaborate across countries. And that's something the International Council of Indian Muslims is definitely interested in, as is the Humanism Project in Australia. And that is a conversation that we can certainly have, hopefully, after this. But moving forward, talking about marginalization, we move on to our next speaker, who has looked at the impact of marginalization on Indian Muslims, the Islamophobia, and how it marginalized Indian Muslims. And if I may quickly introduce him, that's Mr. Shaheen Moiduni, who is a doctoral researcher at the School of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Leeds in the UK. His research interests are Indian Muslims and political agency. He has written and spoken about Islamophobia in general and the nature of Islamophobia in India. Mr. Moiduni will talk about Islamophobia and institutional discrimination in India. Over to you, sir.
Okay. Thank you, and assalamu alaikum to all. And also thank you for the opportunity, and especially thanks to Rashid Saab, Dr. Ritu, Ajit, and all for making this a reality. And also, it's also an honor and a privilege to be here, because people who taught me are there, both in the panel as well as in the audience as well. And also, I think speaking last also has a disadvantage. All the best things are being told, all the important points have been covered. I'll try to add something, and I'll keep it short. To talk about solutions or strategies, it's also very important we understand the nature of the problem we're trying to solve. That is the nature of Islamophobia in India or Indian society. And already aspects of it is mentioned by both Professor Bazian and Ajit Sahi as well. To sum it up short, Islamophobia is deep-rooted in Indian society. Now, the problem with the concept, how it is used in Indian academia or even in Indian activist circles or even in the anti-fascist literature, it is only used as a descriptor or limited to a descriptor of corporeal violence or verbal and physical abuse. Its ability or its potential to be used as a political category is undermined. And it's also because certain categories like racism, it doesn't exist in the Indian social or political Indian lexicon and the Indian social or political lexicon. Now, for example, we have the APPG definition in the UK, on what Islamophobia is. And a simple working definition of Islamophobia is given as Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. Now, although racism as a social or political category doesn't exist in the Indian social sphere, but what it does, the reason, although it doesn't accept as a term, what it does as a concept is it denies agency. And that is quite relevant when you look at India and Indian Muslims. And it is so much that sometimes that the word Islamophobia, even the most staunch anti-fascist figures and personalities disagree using the word Islamophobia on the most flimsiest pretext. Sometimes arguments like rooted in etymology, Islam and phobia, it's a fear of Islam, it doesn't exist in India because Islam is very old, it is not strange. So you have these very essentialist or very flimsiest pretexts, even by those allies who refuse to use this word in its proper context. Now, again, secondly, there is this idea that Islamophobia becomes mainstream, it becomes mainstream discourse either in 2014 with the ascendancy of Modi to power, or post 1990, the Babri Masjid spectacle. But even before that, it is not that this Islamophobia's phenomenon was not there before. It was there before, but in a certain form. Now, for example, if you look at the 1970s and 80s and the writings, you see sometimes certain words quite unique to India, certain terminologies like communal, and then again, other categories from abroad, extremist or fundamentalist. And what we see when these words are used is that it assumes a certain neutral quality or an epistemological neutrality. And it tries to achieve a balance when people use it or when activists and commentators, they use it. So though you would see that there should always be, there's a need for a Muslim counterpart to Hindutva. So Muslim organizations, Islamic movements or Muslim leaders will always be cited and framed with these very framings of extremism or fundamentalism or communalism. So any assertion by Muslims or assertion of Muslim agency is seen as problematic or as polluting the mainstream discourse, even by well-meaning allies. So Muslims only appear as victims or as statistics of violence. So and it's sometimes when I was there, back at home, I was in the thick of things and I used to feel the same way, only as a victim. And the more I try to speak from my terms, I'll be either branded by any one of these terminologies. So it recalls how Du Bois actually said, how does it feel to be a problem? And then again, we look at legislation itself. Now, we had all these terror laws like TADA and POTA, and then post 9/11, we had UAPA. So you have legislations after legislations passed through parliament without much debate or any form of parliamentary opposition we can speak of, overwhelmingly targeting Muslims and equating Muslim terrorism. So we see the war on terror logic also being used. And this is pre-BJP. And now the BJP is deploying the same terror legislations, the UAPA, left, right, and center. And then we realize the gravity of the situation. So how can the mechanisms behind the legislations, or the thought behind the legislations, or the political parties that colluded over it, or the commentators that remain silent, not be understood within a frame of Islamophobia? Then other than social commentaries and legislations, the logic of this is also seeped into the popular rhetoric. For example, it is very common to see the good moderate or the good Muslim, the bad Muslim divide, or the good moderate secular Muslim, or the bad extremist Muslim who's keen on his Muslimness. So from activists to academics to Bollywood, the movie industry have all followed this line. That is the explanatory power of extremism. So of course, Bollywood has taken a giant Islamophobic leap after 2014, but it was always there, literally unquestioned, at least in the 1990s. So what we see is a reinforcing of Islamophobia in the public imagination, even before the BJP came to power. And of course, the Islamophobia, the Sangh Parivar is a whole new level. I'm not trying to equate Islamophobia that was before, that is there, and with the level of Islamophobia of Sangh Parivar. It's another level. But importantly, it cannot be disconnected from the forms of Islamophobia that is already there, nor can it be argued that the earlier forms did not influence what we are seeing today. It is not two separate phenomena. And then what we see is that what the BJP has done in the last eight or more than years is that it has completely changed the political landscape. It has changed the political language. It has changed the agenda of all political parties. So there is no ideology or policy-wise distinction that earlier political parties had. The only aim is to dislodge the BJP electorally at any cost. And Muslims have to be the pole bearers to help in the electoral cause. So if any Muslim politician, or if any Muslim political party is to stand, it will be seen as a stumbling block. It's only viewed as a stumbling block, as a fragmenting the anti-RSS alliance. Also, it also entails that other political parties also start weighing the Hindu vote bank. You see the Congress reaction to the Ram Mandir in Ayodhya. In Kerala, a left communist government, you have 885 people arrested for anti-CA protests. 885 people in the left communist government of Kerala has been arrested for the anti-CA protests. Last week, Muslim students protesting the hijab ban with a banner, resist Islamophobia, was arrested for the reason disturbing public harmony. So resisting Islamophobia banner against hijab ban, arrested because you're disturbing public harmony. Even the love jihad narrative that Professor Bazian talked about, although the BJP is one who expanded it, it originated in a non-BJP state like Kerala. That is where the narrative began. And the last point I want to put on, maybe the second last point. And again, the idea of Islamophobia, again, is very systemic. Always systemic nature of it is always not looked over in India. For example, if you look at the writings of early Muslim scholars or Muslim leaders in the 40s all through 50s and up to the early 60s, you would see that most of them fearing for the future, especially post-partition, there was a fear of the future of the Muslim community in India. And you would see in their writing, their speeches, that the fear was that Muslims would be reduce the plight of the African American community in the US. So as far as they were concerned, the most discriminated, the most alienated, the most racialized community was the African American in the US. And they feared that one day this would be their fate. This was in the 40s and to the 50s. And now you see in 2018, a World Bank working paper titled Intergenerational Mobility in India concluded that in terms of education social mobility, Muslims in India are worse off than their African American counterparts. And this is not something shocking. Earlier in 2006, it's the first time that the figures of Muslim socioeconomic indicators of Muslims were made public in Parliament. It was the first study in 2006. And the report was shocking. It says that only 17% of Muslims above the age of 17 could complete the year 10, the 10th standard, as compared to 26% in other religious groups. In premier universities, you had just hardly 4% for undergrads, 2% for postgrads. And similarly, you have, I could go on numbers. It's a huge study, numbers in terms of private employment, government employment, rural urban poverty, access to loans. Surprisingly, Sachar Committee report uses the same term. They say it is similar to redlining in the US, the access to loans. So entire areas are cordoned off by the banks that if you're from that particular area, you wouldn't get loans. This is seen as a racial demarcation in the US called redlining. And the same term is used, although the Sachar Committee uses the same term, similar to US, it doesn't call it racialization. Again, access to housing, education infrastructure in Muslim dominant villages or communities. You even have the report saying in 3 or 4 major states in North, 1,000 villages not having access to electricity. So you had all these reports coming out. And in all the ensuing narratives, of course, everyone is shocked that this were the figures of Muslim socioeconomic indicators. And in the ensuing narratives, despite being sympathetic to Muslims, the problem was diagnosed either as one of inequality or bad governance or lack of political will. Now, if this was the case in the US, or this was the case in Europe, any other part, it would be seen as a form of systemic racism. It would be seen as a form of systemic Islamophobia. It would be seen as a form of racialized governmentality. But those sorts of analysis still are yet to remain to be said. So again, Islamophobia should be understood as a political concept, as a form of political concept, rather than limiting it to descriptor of as individual violence or abuse. So it cannot be resolved by reasoning or a clearing of misconceptions. It is not pathological. It is not something that happens in someone's head and can be removed by one-on-one clearing of misconceptions or dialogue. I'm not downplaying the role of dialogues here. Dialogues are good and supportive, but it can only be seen as a supportive framework or a strut work to a larger strategy. The issue is political, and the remedial steps should be political. And that requires the opening of the political space, the accommodating of political space for Muslims to assert their agency and identity. Or just like Patricia Hill Collins said, oppressed groups are frequently placed in a situation of being listened to only if we frame our ideas in the language that is familiar to and comfortable for a dominant group. This requirement often changes the meaning of our ideas and works to elevate the ideas of a dominant group. This perfectly captures the position that Indian Muslims and Muslims in India are in. And there's nothing wrong in Muslims speaking or acting on their own terms. Martin Luther, for example, is faith-inspired. Malcolm X was faith-inspired. So this accommodation will allow Muslims to be able to dream their own political future on their own terms. And this will be an ideal first step to resolving the problem of Islamophobia in India. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Shaheen Bhai. Look, we don't have much time for a discussion, but I might just have one question, and then we'll move on to a video, and then it'll be followed by Dr. Stanton's plenary. Just speaking to what Brother Shaheen said, there was the first part, of course, of solving a problem is creating awareness of it. And we've been very fortunate in Australia in that we did a study called, a survey called Sharing Muslim Stories, I think. And that showed 80% of Muslims in Australia felt they had received some form of unfavorable treatment at some stage. Alarming numbers, right? And that result also contributes to real life stories. So there was this woman wearing a hijab sitting in a cafeteria drinking coffee, and a guy comes in. She's a pregnant woman, beats the pulp out of her, right? So it is a very dangerous thing that has to go beyond dialogue and have political interventions. And one great way of doing that is, of course, pooling our resources together. And the question for you, for the panel here, is this. Professor Bazian, you do the Islamic research and documentation project. Sister Rita is associated with the Islamophobia Australia and also does some work on dehumanizing constructs. And the ICIM has an interest in putting people together. So the question is, are there opportunities to work here? Would that help our political and legal and policy advocacy? That's a question open to everyone. Do you want to go? Would you like to start, Professor Bazian?
Well, for me, I think the critical piece is that data is very important because often we are working, or at least engaging, from anecdotal evidence rather than data-driven understanding of the problem and also where we deploy the solution. I'm a strong advocate of using data to drive policy changes, and the policy changes should be at the desk of those on political decision-making, civil society, critical institutions, universities, and so on. And it is a collective responsibility. I'm also against that. The problem is the Muslim, both to be the recipient of structured violence, Islamophobia, and to be given the task of trying to address the prevailing racist attitude, which is driven by policymakers at the highest level. So I think data is very critical, and then shaping responses toward policy changes, that it is the responsibility of those who are entrusted with the society's decision-making to make it possible for a racism, Islamophobia, violence-free environment. In addition, the classrooms, in some of the data that we found, is that teachers themselves are actually purveyors of Islamophobia. So you get into a class where the only piece of literature that is presented is about either the Muslims being violent or how the Muslims are oppressive toward women, and we need to intervene or, in essence, rationalize this problematization of the Muslim subject. So we need also specific intervention at the educational, institutional level, at the teaching level, and those who are responsible for the classroom. Because if you don't teach the next generation, then you're basically engaged in replicating failure. So also a heavy emphasis on educational institutions and making sure that the curriculum and the materials are employed, and then the teachers who are in the classroom, that they are not reflective of normative majoritarian type of racist framing.
Thank you, Professor Bazian. So quick comments from you, Sister Rita and Brother Shaheen. I think the question, to summarize in a way, is that, Brother Shaheen is associated with Strive UK. You have you have a relationship with Islamophobia Australia, and we're talking of data-driven policy. So more people come together, more data, better policy advocacy. Is that a fair statement? Are there opportunities for it?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that it's really important that civil society drives this, because in our community, we can't rely on religious or, some of the more, the figureheads from, the Muslim community internationally, from, to be taking a leadership role in this space. And often too, that in those spaces, we don't see spaces for younger people, for women to flourish. And I think it's really important that civil society actually comes together. The way that we have over Christchurch Call, etc., has been really beneficial in setting norms and not reinventing the wheel in each of our countries. So I would really welcome that.
Yeah, Brother Shaheen and Brother Ajit Saibai, quick comments, and then we'll move on to the video. I'm sorry, I'm not pressurizing you, but
Jane, go ahead. You want to go first?
Always after you, Ajit.
I think Islamophobia in India has still got some life left into it. In the state of Uttar Pradesh, many authorities have established that more than the government of Uttar Pradesh, which is ruled by the BJP, which is India's most populous state, which has reportedly more than 220 million people. If UP was a separate country, it would be the world's 5th most populated country. And 2 years ago, last year, in 2020 and 2021, the level of COVID deaths were 100 times than the ones that were acknowledged by the government. 1:100, that's the ratio. Rivers were floating with corpses. River beds were strewn with corpses. And still, I know people, personally, I know people who lost a woman who lost her husband, a woman who lost her son, a man who lost his wife. I know such people whose loved ones, they did not get any hospital support. The government even refused to give them a death certificate saying that their loved one died of COVID. They were denied even the acknowledgement that their loved one died of COVID. They did not get oxygen. They did not get hospital beds. And in the elections that are going on in UP, they have just voted for the BJP. So the level of, and I'm seeing it in my extended family, I am a Hindu myself. I can barely count on my fingers people who are not Islamophobic anymore. My cousins who are my age, who I have grown up with, are completely flipped over. I often say that it seems to me like a C-grade Manoj Knight Shyamalan movie where some kind of breeze has blown over and everybody has gone crazy. I think there's still, very unfortunately, still quite a bit of life in Islamophobia in India. And it's important to understand the history goes back not more than 150 years ago. It was the British who realized that Hindus and Muslims, they have always lived together as friends and as one people. And unless we sow the seeds of discord between them, even the recognition of the Hindu people, as in a political sense, in a religious sense, was done by the British, not earlier than the mid 19th century. So this is something we have to understand. This is a very, very dangerous path that India is on. And that is why many of us believe that there is a genocide underway. The international community must step into this situation. India, the United States, is really going to bite the dust in India. The US thinks very short term. The United States literally established Islamic extremism and fundamentalism in Pakistan. And today, the United States has lost Pakistan as a reliable ally. It's going to happen at a much worse level in India because India is geographically larger and India has many, many more people than Pakistan has. People in Pakistan are realizing their mistakes now, what they did 30, 40 years ago. India is going to be devastated by Islamophobia. My last point is, I often tell Hindu people, eventually Hindutva will destroy Hindus and Hindu society, then it will destroy Muslims and the Muslim society.
Thank you, Ajit Bhai. That was very powerful words. Any final comment, Shaheen Bhai?
Yeah, I think what Professor Bazi and others mentioned, that there is, for example, the UK, you have a lot of projects, studies in terms of policy, to drive policy, influence policy. You have studies. But again, back in India, even those studies are not possible. For example, Ajit knows that we and my friends of mine, they started a think tank, a quite systematic, with a lot of interns. It's called Quill Foundation. And it's with a singular motive of detailing and looking at terror legislations and how they impact the Muslim community. Their offices were raided, they were hounded. They couldn't do proper research. Their accounts were completely always being examined. They're being questioned. People who even donated to them their zakat or this money were being questioned. So even generating that sort of data from a civil society level is very difficult. And if you go to academia, most universities, you have people from the BJP left wing higher up in the position universities. For example, the research I'm doing at University of Leeds, I'm pretty sure it's impossible for me to do that back in India. It wouldn't be allowed. So then it's a completely different landscape there. And I agree to what Ajit said. And it has become so bad that even by any chance the BJP loses the election, it's a slight chance. But even if they lose, what is going to happen is that you will have a bunch of Islamophobes voting for another party because of some economic concerns. The Islamophobia is still there. It is embedded. So it might be price rise, inflation, some economic concerns or misgovernance. Then happy with this, vote for a different party. The Islamophobia will be a common fact denominator there. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Can I just add one sentence to what Shaheen said, only to prove Shaheen wrong, so that he doesn't go last and I go last after him. I think it's about time that people start, the global, especially the West starts calling India like they are going after Russia, like they're going after China. Often people ask me about India, and I say it's very easy to understand if you start thinking that India is like Russia, India is like China. Its judiciary, its election commission, its legislatures, its news media, it is a dictatorship. To quote Madeleine Albright, who said this about Pakistan 20 years ago, that Pakistan is becoming an international migraine. I think India is now on its way to becoming an international migraine. India is well and truly a basket case.
Thank you, Ajit, by those powerful words. What I might do is I might just go. We're about 10 minutes beyond time. I apologize for that. But we might end with a statement of solidarity from a New South Wales Greens politician, and following that, Professor Stanton will make his concluding remarks for the plenary. So just bear with me while I share this video. Sorry, before I go there, let me just give an introduction. So this is David Shoebridge, who is a New South Wales Greens MP in New South Wales Parliament. He's an environmental and social justice activist and a former barrister. He's been a very strong and consistent voice in supporting us in the campaign against Islamophobia, hate speech and discrimination. He's consistently called out the Australian government for its failure to hold the Indian government accountable for its ongoing assault on civil society, suppression of press freedoms, its promotion of lethal Islamophobia, and egregious violation of human rights of Indian Muslims and other sections of the Indian society. I'll play his video now. Sorry. Just bear with me. It's just... I'm there. I'm almost there. Okay.
I'm David Shoebridge, a Greens MP in the New South Wales Parliament, and I'm speaking to you today from Gadigal land here in Sydney, Australia. And I pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land we're on, the Indigenous people, the Gadigal people, their elders past, present and emerging. There could not be a more critical time to have this conference, to place a focus on the human rights abuses that we have already seen developing in India under the appallingly sectarian politicalisation of the federal government with the BJP administration. But we're also seeing it at a state level throughout India. And the purpose of today's conference is to call out those human rights abuses so as we prevent any potential future genocide within India. One of the primary concerns of human rights observers, both within and outside India, is the way in which important checks and balances that should be there in any liberal democracy to prevent the crimes of an appalling scale such as genocide, the way those checks and balances have been eroded and in some cases actively dismantled by the BJP administration. We have seen the increasing politicisation of the judiciary, with appointments being made that where the government feels certain they will deliver a political outcome in what should be the impartial administration of law. We have seen that already in bail decisions regarding highly politicised charges arising from the Delhi riots. And we have also seen the increasing politicisation of police forces, state and federal. In many cases, very, very disturbing examples of the police stepping aside and allowing sectarian violence to occur, often, almost universally, against minorities within India. And we have also seen the increasing use of federal police in the ongoing occupation of Indian-occupied Kashmir. These actions don't happen by accident. They are part of a sectarian push, an ultra-nationalist push by a government that doesn't want to be bound by the standard norms of international society. They are by a government that is trying to ignore some of the extraordinary rich history that India has of being one of the most successful multicultural, multi-faith nations on the planet. And it's the destruction of those norms that places some of the greatest risk looking forward. Now is the time for India's friends around the world to step up and speak the truth. And it is time for the Australian government in particular to call out these human rights abuses, because we must act to prevent the potential of future genocide within India. To date, the Australian government has been next to silent about the repeated human rights abuses that we've seen in India. Much of that is driven by Australia's perceived self-interest, wanting to team with India on defence and trade for geopolitical reasons. But as a Greens MP, indeed, as a person concerned about global human rights, it is my fundamental belief that the long-term interests of Australia, especially with its relationship with India, are best served by telling the truth to a friend and preventing these crimes in the future. As Australia's trade and defence links with India deepen, it is more important than ever that we insist upon critical human rights clauses in those agreements. No longer should the Australian government be silent. No longer should the High Commissioner, Australia's High Commissioner in India, fail to report upon and call out the human rights abuses. It is in the long-term interests of Australia, as much as it is of India, to ensure that we prevent these future crimes, that we restore the basic civil liberties that have to date been a key part of a successful multi-faith, multicultural India. Good friends tell each other the truth. And the truth is that India at the moment is on a dangerous, dangerous path. This summit is an important event, but I think we should be honest to ourselves that no one summit will resolve all these issues. No one summit will provide the kind of resilience and resolve amongst the global community to take the action needed. And I give this commitment as a Greens MP, whether I'm here in the state parliament or in the Senate in the Australian Parliament. Give this commitment to be willing to be a co-host with other democratic representatives around the world of future summits, because we have a collective responsibility here. Those of us who believe in human rights, who believe in democracy, who believe in successful, thriving, multi-faith and multicultural communities have an international obligation here. No longer is silence acceptable. So I commend the organisers of this summit, but I also commend all of us to work together to shine a spotlight on the crimes that are occurring in India, to prevent unmentionable crimes in the future.
Thank you, David. That was a very powerful speech from David, and thank you for his offer to co-host us, either through the Australian or the New South Wales Parliament, and I'm sure the organisers here will consider that offer. With that, allow me to bring this session to a close and hand it over to Dr. Stanton, who would be offering the final comments on the plenary. And thank you very much for being here and sharing your insights. Dr. Stanton, over to you.
Thank you very much. It has been a real honor to chair this summit, which was put together by a remarkable team that Rashid Ahmed and Ritu Manavi really led, along with Ajit and the whole team. I mean, it's been a wonderful experience to work with these wonderful people. I must say that is what I have learned over this many years that I've worked in human rights, and that is the coalitions are always the best way to go, because coalitions bring so many different kinds of knowledge and talent and abilities to what we do. Also, what the virtual world that we now live in has brought to us is the and that has been a real potent kind of way in which we can take action. I've learned that in a number of places. One, of course, the ICJ case in about the Rohingya genocide, in which a whole number of organizations came together to influence that and to comment on it and so forth. We've also got cases in which genocides in other countries have been opposed, in which we've been able to work with organizations in those countries. An example, for example, is UNITAD, which Genocide Watch actually was the initiator for. We wrote the first UN resolution on that. And UNITAD is the UN investigative team that's documenting the crimes of ISIS, of Daesh. And we then, of course, handed it over to the British. The British always think they write English better than we Americans do. And I think that's okay. They do, in fact. And so, but they took it, they ran with it, they introduced it in the UN Security Council. Mr. Khan became the head of that organization. And now it has gathered huge amounts of evidence that now can be used to put people on trial for their crimes. This conference is another great example of it, because even though, of course, you can't change the world with one conference, as we've been reminded, it can be the beginning of continuing efforts. And that is what, in fact, we hope to do. I know that Rashid and Ritu and others and Ajit and others who organized this conference would like to now continue our work together as a coalition, and we will do that. The Alliance Against Genocide, which Genocide Watch chairs, has over 100 organizations now around the world. And we are going to reconvene the Genocide Working Group here in Washington, D.C. That was the working group that got the US Congress and Senate to pass unanimously its resolution in 2016 that declared that ISIS was committing genocide. That in turn forced the State Department to say it. Their lawyers didn't want to say it, but the Secretary of State overruled them and did. And it was because of that. It was because of those congressional resolutions. That kind of advocacy was because it was a coalition. I think by the end of it, we had at least 50 organizations in the coalition. And this is how we will affect and prevent, I hope, genocide in India. We will be able to muster the force of probably hundreds of organizations through this amazing world that we now live in, this virtual world, and we will be able to influence many governments to say to Mr. Modi and his government, we will not permit this. This will not pass. We will be able to influence policymakers in many governments to diplomatically, possibly even openly, say we cannot permit a genocide in the world's largest democracy. It is not impossible for democracies to have genocides. I mean, the United States has had at least 2 genocides, probably more than that. We had a genocide against our Native American population in which up to 10 million people died. We had a genocide during the slave trade in the passage across the Atlantic, in which probably at least 2 million Africans died. That was genocide. And so democracies can do it. They can actually commit these crimes, especially if they can accomplish removal of citizenship of members of their community. The way democracies can do it is to do it against disenfranchised people. That's what's happened to the Native Americans and to African Americans. We can't let it happen in India. Modi is trying to disenfranchise Muslims in India. That is the first step. It's the first stage. It is the way genocide is being built. They're going to try to expel probably at least 1 million or more Muslims from Assam. They're trying to take back the Hindu control of Kashmir and have Kashmir under martial law now. They have priests, Hindu priests, literally inciting genocide. We see all these early warning signs now. We must stop this. We must prevent this. And it will be, in fact, people of Indian ancestry who will have the most impact here, because you speak the languages, you have the direct contacts, you have, in fact, ways to support civil society organizations in India. And that is, in fact, how this genocide ultimately must be stopped. So I am just really thankful and grateful to you and to all of the people who participated in this symposium, this very impressive symposium. And I thank you this evening. I think, in fact, that we have someone who is going to be reading a statement that was agreed to by some of the organizers of this summit, of this conference.
Dr. Stanton, we are inviting you to do that as a chair.
Oh, okay, very good. Well, I'm not sure I have the final draft, but I certainly have a draft. Okay, I will do that.
Thank you.
We are making a statement that we intend to circulate around the world to let governments know that we will not permit a genocide in India. So this is the statement. The organizers of the India on the Brink Preventing Genocide Summit adopt the following statement. We urge the United States government to accept the recommendations of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom to designate India as a country of particular concern due to its violations of the religious freedoms of Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, and other religious minorities. We urge the governments of the US, Canada, the EU, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand to condemn the persecution of India's 200 million Muslims and 30 million Christians by the Hindutva, Hindu supremacist government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, to condemn open incitement by Hindutva extremists to commit genocide against India's Muslims, and to call upon Prime Minister Modi's government to denounce this incitement. To call upon Prime Minister Modi, his federal ministers, and BJP parliamentarians to renounce their membership in the Rashtriya Swayamsevak, pardon my pronunciation, Sangh, RSS, the paramilitary Hindu supremacist movement, to communicate to the Indian government that its persecution of Muslims and Christians will not be tolerated by the democracies of the world. And if India continues this persecution, it will face sanctions that will impede India's economic and international relations. To denounce discriminatory laws in India, including the Citizenship Amendment Act, the National Register for Citizens, the anti-conversion laws, the love jihad laws, the application of the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act to human rights organizations, to condemn arbitrary incarcerations and institution of criminal charges against innocent Muslims and Christians who are prisoners of conscience, to protest the failure of BJP state governments to prosecute Hindutva nationalists who perpetrate hate crimes against Muslims, Christians, and other minorities. We will be circulating this statement to governments all over the world, and we will be campaigning to stop this genocide in its tracks. I thank all of you.
Thank you, Professor Bazian. Thank you, thank you, Professor Stanton. I'm sorry. And with that, with everyone's permission, I will call this plenary to a close. And thank you very much for being here. It was very empowering, and in many ways, it was empowering those at the margins of the marginalized, and for all of you to come together and empower us, we could not be more grateful. Thank you for your work, Professor Stanton, Professor Bazian, Ajit Sahibai, Shaheen, Rita Jabri, Rashid Bhai, and Ritu, and the other organizers who are not here. Thank you very much.